tonight, and welcome to Future of the Democratic Party. Everyone could just silence their cell phones. That would be a huge help. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Pomona Student Union, or PSU. My name is Aaron Segi. I'm a junior here at Pomona, and I'm a vice president of the PSU. We're a nonpartisan, student-run organization committed to challenging assumptions and increasing the level of open and honest dialogue on campus. We advocate for no party or platform, and our only agenda is to bring in a multiplicity of perspectives so that you all can draw your own conclusions. That continues tonight, and we'll be discussing the Democratic Party with a spirit of inquiry, critique, and exploration. This includes you. The second part of the discussion will be an audience Q&A. So we are so honored to have Jamelle Bouie and Sarah Leonard with us here tonight. Jamelle Bouie is chief political correspondent for Slate magazine, where he writes on national politics. He's based in Washington, D.C., and his work has appeared in the American Prospect, the Daily Beast, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the New Yorker Online. Jamelle is a native of Virginia Beach, Virginia, and he attended the University of Virginia, where he graduated with degrees in political and social thought and government. Sarah Leonard is senior editor at The Nation magazine and co-editor of the book, The Future We Want, Radical Ideas for a New Century. She's also a contributing editor to Dissent and to The New Inquiry. She attended Columbia University, where she majored in history, and she is based in New York City and is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. So, Democrats lost the White House last November, and despite picking up seats in both the Senate and the House, they're still a minority in both chambers. In the states, Democrats are at their lowest level of power since the 1920s, and they hold unified control of only 6 state governments, compared to 25 for Republicans. So our first question is, what led to those losses from the presidential race on down? Now, since November, there's been a lot of debate about what kind of policies and message the party should stand for, but no clear consensus has emerged. We're now in the middle of a series of special elections for congressional seats in Kansas, Georgia, Montana, South Carolina, and even here in Southern California. So this means that congressional candidates are putting different strategies to the test right now in real time. So our second question is, where should the Democratic Party go in terms of both policy and message? One of the other developments since November has been the emergence of the anti-Trump resistance, grassroots activism, independent of Democratic elected officials. This has come in the form of the Women's March, airport protests, town hall meetings, and last weekend's March for Science. Meanwhile, established organizations like Planned Parenthood and the ACLU have seen a surge in donations, and third parties like the Democratic Socialists of America have had their membership increase rapidly. So this raises a third question. At a time when the stakes are so high for the left, are Democrats even up to the task, or should other groups take the lead? So Jamelle, we'll have you go first.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me out here. Weather's lovely. I came from rainy DC, so it's very pleasant to be here. Literally, it's much more pleasant. So, thinking about this question of like what happened last year, I think it's worth kind of going through a couple of things. So some of them I think are structural and don't really have much to do with the Democratic Party itself, and some of them obviously have to do with the Democratic Party. The structural things, in thinking about both the presidential race and the congressional races and so on down, is a little bit of a reversion to the mean, right? Sort of, it's a long-standing observation that it's difficult for a party that's held the White House for 2 terms to then win the White House a 3rd time. It's happened basically twice in the past 100 years. Now, there's 2 ways to look at that, right? The first way is that because it's happened twice, we can't really draw any conclusions about it. It's too small of an end to say anything. But the other way to look at it is that when these kinds of elections come up, the public tends to want to change, and it's a pretty consistent phenomena. And so here, looking at the presidential results at least, you see kind of a steady, you don't see a dramatic shift from 2012 numbers. What you see is a steady shift that's sort of in line with what you would expect from this kind of time for a change factor. And it happened among demographic groups that were pretty well distributed and sort of advantaged the Republicans even more, or advantaged the Republican candidate. And it's sort of worth noting that if you looked at the beginning of 2016 and you looked at all the models of the election that kind of took various things into account, GDP, presidential popularity, wage growth, whatever, all of them forecasted a very narrow Republican win. Very few forecasted a Democratic win. But the thinking among the modelers is that the economy's fine, it's not great, the president is popular, he's not that popular, and it's a generic Democrat going for a third term is going to have an uphill battle against a generic Republican. And for all the twists and turns of the 2016 race, that's basically what happened. And if pundits and observers are to take any fault, it's kind of for not just sort of going with that initial forecast and underestimating the extent to which someone even as transgressive as Donald Trump would eventually become kind of just a normal candidate in the eyes of most American voters. So, reversion to the mean. So, even if that's the case, I don't think it's quite enough to explain the unusual elements of last year. Among them, sort of the unified voting among upwards of 60% of white Americans for Donald Trump. And I think for that, in the second bullet point in this list of things to consider, it's just the role of race demagoguery last year. It's sort of banal at this point to note that Trump ran a pretty racist campaign, really against immigrants, Muslims, black protesters, but I think it's underappreciated how that actually changed the electoral landscape. Put this way, in 2008, the economy was extremely bad, the president was extremely unpopular, and for a category of voters who had been trending Republican for the past 4 or 5 cycles, and that is whites without whites without college degrees, rather, those conditions were bad enough to warrant a Democratic vote. And the McCain campaign ran a pretty typical Republican campaign. In 2012, things were still not great, and also the Republicans nominated a candidate who was sort of representative of the kinds of people who made them that way. And so again, this group of people had a reason to vote for a Democrat. But in 2016, conditions were average, and you had a Republican candidate who basically ran on race identity, on saying that if elected president, I will raise the both symbolic and material wages of what it means to be white. And this Republican trending group of voters went back. They rejected the Democratic appeal, and we'll get to the Democratic appeal and the problems with it, but that's what they did. It is worth thinking about how an explicit racial appeal, like the one we saw from Trump, changes how voters themselves think about the stakes in an election. Because now there's a new axis for disagreement. It's not just who's going to put more money in my pocket, who's going to defend my social values around abortion or contraception or sort of anything else. It is now also, how do I feel about living in an open society? How do I feel about living in a cosmopolitan society, in a multiracial society? And we know from social science that there are lots of Americans, many Americans, who are kind of uncomfortable with that. And so thinking about the presidential race and its sort of down ballot consequences is worth considering how race demagoguery kind of just shifted the landscape and opened up a whole new area of dispute that, frankly, no one was really prepared to deal with. Okay, 2 more things on this kind of structural level. The first is that the Democratic Party coalition, despite electing President Obama twice, revealed itself to be pretty brittle, right? That like it encompassed a large number of different categories of Americans, but because of their geographic distribution in cities, on coasts, and because of their varying attendance to elections, right? It's sort of like a cliche that young people don't really come out to vote, but many different elements of that coalition were relatively infrequent voters. So taken together, it required sort of much more investment in trying to bring those people out to the polls than we saw, which kind of gets to the candidate and the Democratic Party itself. So I'm going to kind of leave Clinton for last and go to the Democratic Party itself, which, for as much as it faced headwinds during the Obama period, it faced sort of the headwinds that comes with having this brutal coalition. It faced the headwinds that just come with holding the White House. It's a pretty consistent pattern that when you hold the White House, you tend to lose seats in congressional elections, and then this very polarized period that can often mean very large losses. Looking at how the Democratic Party, the National Democratic Party at least, because, and this is a quick and important parenthetical, right, but that like, there is the National Democratic Party, but then there are also 50 Democratic parties, and each of them is a little different, has a somewhat different approach, and it's sort of hard to generalize. And some of them are quite strong and good and have done well over the past 8 years, and some of them are quite bad. But the National Democratic Party, at least, didn't do the kind of party building and investment across the board that would have at least created stopped the worst from happening. And so 2010 is probably going to be a bad year for Democrats regardless, just that's the nature of things. But there's a difference between things being like kind of bad, right? Like 2014 was kind of bad for Democrats. If there's a difference between that and an utter catastrophe that ends up not just destroying your majorities in the House and the state level, but also sets up a situation where 2010 is a census year, it's a redistricting year. It sets up a situation where now your opponents can shape the ground for future elections, making it even more difficult for you to make those gains. And so the lack of serious party building, which is a misstep on part of the people leading national Democratic organizations, not just the DNC, which is very visible right now, but the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the DSCC, which is an acronym I never quite remember what it stands for, but who cares? It's called the DSCC, it's the Senate wing of all of those folks. And then also the Obama White House. Obama was a notoriously poor party builder, was not that invested in the project of building up the Democratic Party. And so that kind of set up the party for a whole bunch of failures down the line, including 2016, including the big state level losses, which for as much as those are structural, not just the pendulum swing, but many of those losses were down south, where the party was already shifting, big problem there. So Clinton, and I've gone a little too long, so I'll just make this quick. The thinking before the election was that like Hillary Clinton was an experienced enough candidate, was a tested enough candidate that she would probably perform about as well as a generic Democrat, or maybe even a little better. The reality is that Hillary Clinton carried a tremendous amount of baggage, stemming both from her history and her missteps. Chief among them, I think, the decision to give those Wall Street speeches, and sort of an unwillingness to show transparency that, whether understandable or not, really hurt her. And in addition to her personal characteristics, ran a campaign that I think made an understandable misstep in how it dealt with Trump. And what it did was it presumed that the way to deal with Trump was to highlight what made him transgressive. Turned out that what made him transgressive made him attractive to a lot of people. And the counterfactual is, what if Clinton had run a Obama 2012 campaign against Donald Trump, ignoring the fact that he ran a racist campaign, ignoring the demagoguery, and focusing instead on the plutocratic policy program. I think that might have made a real difference. So, personal characteristics of Clinton, campaign missteps, and then kind of the big meta thing is that like this race was decided by 80,000 votes in 3 states. So like, I think my explanation accounts for like a lot of the shit that were wrong, but it's also the case that like at that narrow margin, literally everything matters, and maybe nothing matters. Maybe we're just kind of over-explaining this whole thing, and it's always worth keeping the null hypothesis in mind that like maybe I'm just full of shit, and there's nothing really to explain, and that we're just looking at the dice rolled the wrong way this time.
You can't tell a bunch of young politically active students that it's a coin toss.
You know what? The universe loves coin tosses.
And shit makes great fertilizer.
That's a good point.
So there's value.
You all are the seeds.
So Sarah, what led to 2016? Where did Democrats go? Or are they not up to the task?
Okay. So I'll try to get into a little of that, and then hopefully we can explore it further. And I promise I'm up here using my phone for notes and not Twitter. Like a true millennial, that's where my notes are. So I did want to start by thanking Erin especially for doing a lot of work and setting this up, and also Audrey and Ellen and everyone else who's been involved. We really appreciate it. And it's nice to come out to your beautiful campus, because New York, like DC, is disgusting right now. So I want to put the American election in a global context to start. So Hillary Clinton was not the only mainstream, roughly centrist candidate who lost in the last few years in fairly dramatic fashion, both candidates and initiatives. Famously Brexit is an example where no one believed that something as crazy as Brexit could happen. No one wanted to believe the polling, and yet this fairly dramatic break with Europe is taking place. And we've seen the rise of populist political movements across Europe, most of them right-wing, some left-wing. And on a slightly different timeline, in the Philippines, in Turkey, in India. And so we're dealing with a sort of not quite global, but a very broad sort of backlash that's happening right now. And I think that the US is part of that. And one piece of that is a sort of question of sovereignty that's being grappled with. So in Europe, it's easy to see where people might feel that they're no longer in control of their countries or their democracies. European countries that are part of the EU don't actually control their own currency. They are subject to some degree to a European form of governance that is very sort of loosely elected by the people and difficult to see. In a country like Greece that's undergone a huge amount of austerity, people have voted in a populist government to undo the austerity, but they can't because the EU says no, right? So people's own electoral processes feel thwarted. There's also the question of increasing immigration, obviously, and this is where people's racism and xenophobia comes into play alongside a legitimate quest for sovereignty. And so you're seeing a lot of people grappling in various ways to control what they regard as their country in both optimistic utopian ways and truly horrible ways. In the US, I think it's worth noting, Piketty, who you all may have heard of, if not read, his giant book, Capital in the 21st Century, has pointed out that wealth is accumulating towards the top 1% or the top 0.1% rapidly, and the distance between them and everybody else is increasing extremely rapidly. Alongside that, what we're seeing is that democracy can't survive under those conditions. So there was a now sort of famous Princeton study that showed that when it came to legislative outcomes, wealthy individuals and their organizations, typically businesses, exercised a substantial amount of control over legislative outcomes, whereas the control exercised by sort of normal people and their institutions, like unions or community organizations, was, quote, negligible. So when people say, why aren't young people going out and voting? Why doesn't everyone get involved in our democratic process? People aren't stupid, people can tell when they do and don't have influence. And I think we're seeing a real lack of faith in that process. So there's a lot going on there that has produced a backlash that demands populism, that is seeking outsiders to sort of get into this system somehow that people feel extremely excluded from. And the Democrats have proven not to be a great vehicle for doing this. Left institutions have been under assault since the 70s, really, when union membership started declining under massive assault, including from Reagan, of course. And one of the results is that it's actually very hard to do political organizing on the left right now, because it used to be unions would teach their members politics, right? And people would go out and campaign and so forth. Currently, 11% of American workers are in unions, so that's not a lot of people to be putting through that political education. It makes the left weak. And at the same time, over the last decades, Democrats have sort of embraced globalization. They've become more of a party of neoliberalism. And so they unsurprisingly were not great at rising to the task of a populist moment. What we saw was in a year when people are suffering from the fact that we haven't really recovered from the financial crisis, and people are clearly very dissatisfied. We've had eruptions like Occupy showing how dissatisfied people are. The Democrats thought, how can we capture this? I know, another Clinton. That's a good idea. And so in this sort of most populist of moments globally, the Democrats picked literally the most establishment candidate you could conceivably find, who not only is, practically speaking, an establishment politician, but is perceived by everybody as such. Meanwhile, I think there have been a lot of interesting things happening to the left of that the Democrats chose not really to seize on. So, young people have been embracing something obviously to the party's left. And this comes out of Occupy, the movement for Black Lives, and sort of found its focus in the Bernie campaign most recently. But this is a generation where, we came of age not during the Cold War, really, but after the Cold War, and came to political consciousness during the financial crisis. As a result, we're not afraid of the communists coming and taking our stuff, right? We're afraid of Wall Street. People's parents lost jobs. People couldn't get jobs after school. People had debt. People still have debt. And so there's a sort of generational shift in thinking about what the reasonable bounds of politics are. Now, that sort of found its focus in Sanders. Sanders, by any standard abroad, is a fairly moderate social democrat. Everyone in Europe would be like, yes, he wants healthcare. Right, yeah, we're humans. And he would not be terribly controversial. In the US, he is in part because he calls himself a socialist, right? Even though he doesn't outright condemn capitalism or anything like that. He condemns casino capitalism. I'm never sure what he means by that, but and I think it was a true measure of how much people wanted an alternative, that this sort of outsider politician who honestly totally lacks charisma became wildly popular. He would give the same stump speech every time. The 1% have taken almost everything. The 99%, I'm like, oh my God, I literally can't listen to one of his speeches, but people loved it because finally someone wasn't lying to us, right? And so what I thought was the Democratic Party might conceivably learn something from this. And it seems to me that has really not been the case. A lot of the engagement I had with Hillary supporters during the election was of saying sort of, why is Bernie coming and ruining this election for us? Whereas the way that I would think about it is, in a what I think is sort of a populist moment, Bernie is kind of saving the party from itself. He's offering something that the party did not choose to offer, which is clearly wildly popular. And it seemed to me that after the election, perhaps the party would take advantage of this, and the sort of like proxy election for this was voting in the chair of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee. There was a sort of Bernie candidate, Keith Ellison, who even Chuck Schumer endorsed. Everyone was like, okay, we gotta have our Bernie guy, we gotta concede that he's influential in the party now. And instead, Obama got his own candidate in the race, Perez, who's not a bad guy, but was a clear mark that the establishment was actually going to choose to exclude this Bernie person. And so what I think is interesting is that there's a lot of energy right now. I'm part of DSA. DSA's numbers have gone way up. And I think there may be some DSA people here even. You can talk to them after the event. And I think that that is going to need to build into something strong that can influence the Democratic Party, and not something that should be immediately absorbed by the Democratic Party. And we can talk more about that. But I don't see a lot of evidence that the Democratic Party is going to come to represent the values that a lot of people expressed during the primary.
Thanks. Jamelle, if you want to respond to that. Also, do you want to address kind of where the party should head, and also what's the role of groups outside of it?
Sure. Respond makes it sound like I have like particular disagreements, which is not so much. I'll just like make a few comments, and I guess I'll go backwards to forwards. So it's this idea of like what should a group like DSA, or what should any sort of not any kind of group that wants to influence electoral politics do vis-a-vis the Democrats is really interesting, because you have to first answer the question, like, what is the Democratic Party exactly, right? Like, the Republican Party is actually pretty easy to answer in this score. It's an ideologically conservative party. That's what it's been since the 1980s. If you are a Republican, it is almost axiomatic that you are a conservative, or you find yourself in some sort of conservative tradition. But really, up until the past 10 years, you have not really been able to say that about the Democratic Party at all. It's, in a lot of ways, everyone not a Republican falls into the Democratic Party. So that includes, liberals, progressives, so on and so forth. That includes, formerly blue dog Democrats, sort of just like moderate conservative Southerners who saw a role for government. It includes sort of West Coast tech folks. It includes sort of people with divergent interest and divergent ideas about what constitutes like good policy, what government should do, but that all kind of vaguely agree that government should do something. And so if the Democratic Party, it's a part of the problem, in terms of kind of getting the Democratic Party to do anything or move to the left, is that it's an interest group party. And so while there are ideological interest groups within it, a lot of those interest groups, whether they are business interest groups or whatever, are looking more towards their sort of like parochial interest or parochial priorities here. So yeah, what do you do with that? It seems like that one approach is to not treat the Democratic Party so much as an ideological formation, and to essentially say it's a ballot line, right? Like that, everywhere in the country, if you run an election, you can run as a Democrat, and to treat the label as you want to treat it. And so this should be sort of mimicking the approach of ideological conservatives in the 50s and 60s, right? To say that we will use the Republican Party as a vehicle for our ideological views, and we will do that by essentially situating ourselves within and without. We will engage in internal party politics, we will take advantage of fissures in internal party politics, but then we'll also act as a pressure group outside of it. It seemed to work for them. There are a variety of reasons why it did. One of those is that this was also coinciding with the rise of like a grassroots conservative evangelical movement that provided needed foot soldiers and money. But you can see in that kind of a model for engagement in the future. But I think this kind of meta question, like what exactly is the Democratic Party, is like a really important one to answer, because I don't think it is sort of like a uniformly, centrist establishment party. Like it's clearly not, just looking at the diversity of people within the Democratic Party. But it is also clear that like its elite members have like particular views and particular interests they want to defend and want to preserve. So what do you do with that? This is sort of not related to the Democratic Party per se, but it is kind of this question of like the populist moment we're living in. And I think it's also worth thinking about like what exactly is that populism? What is that populism, right? It's certainly true that a portion of it does reflect the really terrible situation people under the age of 34 have found themselves in over the last decade as a result of the recession, the slow recovery, of the explosion of student debt, and so on and so forth. But as far as the current president and his supporters, it's actually a little unclear if their grievances are primarily economic, right? Like, no, really. I mean, you look at who backed Donald Trump, and it was not the poorest voters. It was not the voters who saw the sharpest declines. It was not the voters who whose wages are stagnating most. They either didn't vote, or they were Black and Latino and didn't vote for Donald Trump. Trump's core voters were what you would describe as like the petit bourgeois, right? Like people who do well enough. They aren't wealthy, they aren't poor, they're not struggling. Maybe their kids aren't doing as well as they hope, but they're not also doing poorly. If it is a declining town, they are the police officers, they are the city workers, they are the small business owners, they are this category of people. They're very angry about something. Given that they consistently vote for candidates who push policies that kind of hurt their pocketbooks, I'm not sure that their primary grievance is economic, although it is tied up and sometimes understood or expressed as an economic grievance. But that's a separate conversation.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting conversation to have, because I think no one has quite come up with the perfect framework for describing that, but it's absolutely the petit bourgeois, and there's all this conversation about the white working class, whatever that is. And nobody during this election could define what that group of people was.
Right.
Because the Trump voters, as you're saying, are people who are maybe police, maybe small business owners, and the way that polling tends to work is when they're talking about the working class, they're talking about a certain level of income and a certain level of education. But that doesn't actually describe what you do during the day, who you are. And the difference between being a small business owner and being a wage worker is a totally different subject position. If you're a boss, you have both different practical priorities in terms of policy, but also a different mentality. Your job is to manage workers, and your job is to be a boss. If you go to work every day for a wage, especially a low one, you hate your boss. You hate the boss. And that's a different subject position. And that is one of the reasons that, it's actually it's helpful to, if I'm gonna go Marxist on you, determine where people stand in relation to the means of production, because it has political consequences. And I think, I would like to see this sort of thing unpacked more, these terms, for sure. And I have a writer, Jesse Meyerson, who's working on a piece about this right now, which I think will be fun, which he originally titled Brown Shirts in the Suburbs, to suggest that the nascent fascism that people have identified is actually being formed around like backyard barbecues and not in the coal mines. And I think this question too of what the Democratic Party is fascinating. By the standards of many countries, and again I'll return to Europe, America doesn't have parties. We don't have parties in the traditional sense because you can't kick anyone out of a party. In the UK, for example, if you want to be a member of the Labour Party, you sign up to be a member of the Labor Party. It's not just how you're registered. And were you to deviate radically from the Labor Party platform, you can be kicked out of the Labor Party because clearly you don't adhere to the platform of the Labor Party. And if you're a politician who is a member of the Labor Party, you can be censured by the head of the party, or you can be expelled. And so there's a certain level of party discipline that turns a party into an ideologically coherent entity. I don't want to overemphasize how perfect that is, but that's sort of the structure. And here obviously, that what we mean is, oh, you tend to vote on that ballot line, or maybe you're registered that way. But it doesn't even really mean that. I'm a registered Democrat because I want to vote in New York primaries, which you have to be a registered Democrat to do. But I vote on the Working Families Party line because we have fusion voting. None of that makes any sense, right? And it's not of a piece of being part of a coherent party. And this actually used to be more contested. So in the 70s, under Carter, and we think of Carter as a good Democratic president, he's actually pretty weak on labor, on protecting labor. And one of the problems that labor had with Carter was that they had put some things in the Democratic Party platform, decided on at the convention, about bills that he was going to try to pass to back up the labor movement. And he didn't really try to do it. And so they were pretty pissed, and they're like, what we need to do is we need to create some form of platform accountability. And they made a short-lived thing called the Progressive Alliance, I believe, to try to force the party to institute platform accountability. This totally failed. And as you know now, like if any of you are nerds and follow the conventions, the platform is a joke. It doesn't matter what it says in the platform. No one's accountable to it. It's just another sort of spectacle where there's some horse trading. So I think that's sort of worth considering what the structure of a more successful party would be if we wanted to form something on the left, whether that would mean registering as a party or doing something other than that so that we don't have to abide by party law and that sort of framework. And I would agree that the Democratic Party has lost ideological coherence, which is something we would want to create in any new institution. My favorite is a quote from someone who described the Democratic Party as the second most enthusiastic party of capital. I was like, that sounds about right. So I think right now we're in a situation where people can at least see that there's like a war on between Wall Street and the big banks and everybody else, and they kind of just want some organization to be like, we are unequivocally on your side. And what people don't understand when they're like, oh, Hillary gave a speech, Obama gave a speech, whatever, it's not that big a deal, is that everybody looks at that and says, you're hobnobbing with the people who are grinding us into the dirt. Fuck you. And I think that's a completely reasonable position to ask people to pick a side. And that's something that the Democratic Party exists not to do right now. And so I think looking at what the sort of alternative structures would be to do that would create that sort of ideological coherence is really worth doing in the way Jamelle was describing there.
Great. So thank you. So imagining the party could pick a side, hypothetically, you've written that Democrats should adopt more economic populism. In an article for Vox, Andrew Prokop made an argument that might not work based on some Senate results from 2016. So specifically, he looked at some states that flipped for Trump this cycle. And so in Wisconsin, Russ Feingold was the Senate candidate, and in Ohio, Ted Strickland was the Senate candidate for the Democrats. And both campaigned, as Prokop described, as populists. And Russ Feingold earned 2% fewer votes than Clinton in Wisconsin, and Ted Strickland earned 13% fewer votes in Ohio. Meanwhile, in Evan Bayh in Indiana and Jason Kander in Missouri both campaigned as moderates or centrists, according to Prokop, and they earned 10 and 16% fewer votes than Clinton in their respective states. So what do you make of that argument? Was something lacking with Feingold and Strickland's populism? And why should Democrats just try and run more Kanders and Evan Bayh?
Yeah, I thought this was sort of a strange article, and actually Jamelle tends to be savvier about elections and in their particulars than I often am. But
yeah, I found it like a pretty, like I get the argument being made. I just thought it was sort of like ignored the nationalization of elections like a lot. But
yeah, definitely. And I thought it cherry-picked a few examples in kind of a weird way in order to create a trend. And I kind of read it. It was also quite short. I was like, oh, you had a blog quota that day, didn't you? It was like, not a good article. But, if you want to look at Evan Bouie, who has the best chin in the Senate, or used to, we should keep in mind, first of all, so the argument is that he's more centrist and he did better than Clinton in his state. Let's keep in mind that he lost, first of all. So I'm not sure that imitating marginally less failed candidates is a great strategy for the Democratic Party. And he started off with higher polling numbers than he ended up with. He was well known in the state. And then over the course of the campaign, his numbers just went down. So again, I'm not sure this is a great example for us to follow. And of course, Bernie actually beat Hillary, not by a huge margin, but in Indiana. And I think it would have been interesting to see what having an actual populist in the race would have looked like. That said, I don't think that I want to adhere to a sort of Bernie would have won message, which I don't think is necessarily the case, and in fact is likely not the case. And I also don't want to make a sort of specious argument that multiracial, anti-patriarchal economic populism is the winning key that nobody thought of and everything would have been great had that been the platform, although we're going to get there. And there's also the argument from the other side that, Hillary won the popular vote. Why are we all freaking out about this? She actually did pretty well, and if Mook hadn't been so obsessed with his particular forms of outreach and whatever, everything would have been fine. So why do we need to adopt economic populism? So I would say that my argument is not purely electoral. It is partly electoral, but I also think it's ethical. When we talk about should the Democratic Party be more populist, should it not, we tend to think of this as sort of a conversation about strategy. But if what you think parties are for is as a vehicle for the things we believe should exist in the world to come into the world, then having a party with a useless centrist platform has no purpose. And I think one of the things we're seeing is that people actually want a lot more than that. So when Bernie makes a commitment, for example, to universal single payer, people are welcome to say we're not going to get that tomorrow. But what you will absolutely never pass? A thing that you don't even say you want. And so when the nurses came on board for Bernie, what they said was, we see people come in, and I was interviewing one of them. She's like, look, people come in on stretchers, and they ask us how much it's going to cost. And that's so dark, right? And they're like, we're on board for single payer. We need single payer. It's an ethical commitment to us. And so I would argue both that we are in a populist moment and that we need to organize towards building that populist moment into legislation and policy that's actually worth having, instead of beginning by compromising it away with an imaginary moderate Republican before we even vote. And so I think for all those reasons, you can keep Evan Bouie. I'm not sure that's a future that is helpful to anyone.
Y'all have anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's worth really focusing down on this point that what you're trying to drive at is a party that makes an ethical commitment. Because if you're talking just strategy, there are many different ways to win elections, right? One way, based on what I kind of think is happening with at least a portion of the American electorate, you can kind of imagine that one way, if the Democratic Party were solely focused on winning, one way to win would be to recalibrate yourself in the mode of kind of like a Heron Volkish, meaning sort of like, you know, white ethno-nationalist party. You could say, you know, we will be sure to deliver benefits to people like you and not to people like them. And I think that actually be a pretty effective message in large parts of the country, which is depressing as hell, but that's the world we live in. And of course, we don't want that. We want a party that maintains a commitment to multiracial democracy, and that also has a commitment to people's material advancement. And so that's like the conundrum, and I think Sarah is very right to say that like this question needs to be thought of in ethical terms as well. What makes a good society, and what are the ways you can take to get there? I in fact think part of the Democratic, insofar that there is, you know, a singular Democratic Party, I think part of its problem has been this narrow focus on sort of eking out victories and not really thinking hard about what exactly they want to do. And that's not to say that there are not people in the Democratic coalition that are thinking hard about what they want to do. They very much are. But there's always going to be a tension between kind of your Rahm Emanuel types and use another politician or Elizabeth Warren types who are in politics for very different reasons. I'll make a kind of a second subordinate point, I guess, which is that, actually, no, never mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
So kind of going off of that, still considering potential directions that the Democratic Party could go in, you've written that, you know, there's no such thing as a good Trump voter, and specifically that Trump voters don't deserve empathy from people on the left. So
Exactly what I wrote, but
that was it was in the headline. So kind of what is your argument there? Why is that the case? And thinking, I guess, both electorally and also programmatically, if Democrats shouldn't, you know, empathize, or if that's not your argument, you know, if they shouldn't try and appeal those people, does that mean they shouldn't be competing for their votes? And what are kind of the electoral consequences of that?
So that article, which caused me no end of grief.
I think I saw some of that on Twitter, maybe.
Yeah, a little bit. So what that article is arguing, so like the headline, which is "No such thing as a good Trump voter," which my wonderful editor put on because he thought it would get attention, and it did. The article was responding to something that I was seeing a lot of in the wake of the election, which was this. It was, on one hand, you have people making the observation that whatever else we can say about the election so far, it is certainly true that some number of 60 million Americans said to themselves, racial demagoguery isn't so bad that I can't vote for a guy who's engaged in it. And that this says something very ugly about like how our politics are structured, the kind of country we still live in, and so on and so forth. And the reaction to that was, how dare you call 60 million Americans racist? How dare you? And so what I wrote, responding to that response, was to say, listen, we don't know what is in the hearts of 60 million Americans. It's certainly true that many of those people simply pulled a lever next to the candidate and R next to their name. Some number of them, probably more than people like to think, but some number of them were very much invested in this sort of like racial demagoguery, but who knows? Who knows what's in their hearts? What we do know is that Trump ran a certain kind of campaign. He made certain kinds of promises. He promised to harass immigrants. He promised to turn his attention, the government's attention, to harassing Muslims. He promised to sort of kind of impose the use of state force against disfavored racial minorities. That is the thing that Trump promised, and that is and has been, looking at the increase in immigration rates, looking at the very real harassment of Hispanic immigrants across the country by officers of the state. That is a consequence of supporting Trump. And so who cares if these people are racist? I certainly don't care if they personally dislike anyone, but we shouldn't ignore the consequences of their political choice, and it was a political choice. And moreover, if your response is to say, oh, we have to understand them. Understanding's great, but the risk of that is that you end up obscuring those motivations, which are racialized. You end up obscuring the extent to which millions of white Americans have, and historically have, been invested in the maintenance of race hierarchy. And if you obscure that, then you leave yourself in a place where you kind of can't really, not only can you understand what happened broadly, but if the worst happens, right, like if an atrocity happens, you end up in this this logical and rhetorical place where you say, well, oh, they didn't really want that, right? They didn't mean for that to happen. It's like, well, then what did they mean to happen? And so that was the article. That was the argument. And I wrote that like a week or so after the election, and I still very much think that's the case. I think that one must understand Trump support as representing sort of not regardless, but sort of, it's not as dependent on sort of the individual motivations of every individual person, but it's like a broad sociological phenomena. I think you have to understand Trump's election as an attempt to reinforce the structures of race hierarchy in this country, and that one must understand that in the United States, people understood their position in terms of that race hierarchy, that people, and white Americans in particular, as a group, not every individual, but as a group, have often in one breath wanted material safety, and have defined that material safety in opposition to the presence of black people, the presence of immigrants, and so on and so forth. So I think that does have consequences for like how you think about political engagement. One of those consequences is that I, myself, would be wary of rooting a populist appeal in the particular needs of predominantly white communities, because those predominantly white communities may understand their economic security in ways that are highly racialized, right? Not just that I want healthcare, but also I also want my school to be good and my neighborhood to be safe. And this, I should say, this applies to northern liberals as much as anyone else, right? Like there's in New York City right now, there's recurring battles over integrating schools. We're like good, nice liberals. We're like, well, I don't know if I want all those poor black kids in my kid's elementary school. So one practical consequence is that maybe a more inclusive populist message is rooted in the particular concerns of communities that are on the bottom of a race hierarchy, right? And so your populism starts in the Black Belt. It starts in the Rio Grande Valley. It doesn't necessarily start in industrial Ohio. But yeah, whatever that means electorally, I think in terms of like movement building, I think start rooting a populism in what does a poor black person need in this country leads you to a different place and brings different commitments in asking what does a coal miner need. Even though superficially they might be the same, they're not really the same. And that's an insight you miss, I think, if you ignore the role race and racial understanding plays in how people think about their positions in the world. Or to put like in electoral terms, there's actually a reason why black people across class lines basically vote the same way. And it's tied to how they understand the relationship between their material position and their race.
I mean, I think something that you're pointing to is, of course, that when people say, well, is it economic resentment or is it racism, it's always, those things are so mixed up in American history and politics and in the structure of our society that it's a meaningless question. Because it's not that, some white person who voted for Trump necessarily spends all day walking around saying, like, I hate Muslims and black people and women, and that's why I'm going to vote for this guy who clearly hates all three. But rather that maybe that guy voted for Obama because he was like an outsider, should really get in, and then he was like, wow, like the value of my property feels under threat because there are immigrants coming into my neighborhood and my community, and or maybe just I feel a bit of economic anxiety because, like in many places right now, my property value is declining. And for that person to then go and understand what's happening to them in racist terms is all American. So like the idea of property being devalued by the proximity of Black people is an American classic, which has its roots not just in a long history of racism, but in federal policy. I mean, that's what redlining was, where literally white people's property value would go down by proximity to Black residents. And so when a white person then doesn't want a Black person moving into their neighborhood, do they describe that as, well, I value my property over this person's humanity? No, what they're gonna do is be like, well, they're gonna come up with some reasons. And those reasons are gonna sound like, we really need to make sure the neighborhood's safe.
Right.
We really need to, all sorts of things that imply that the problem lies not with them, but with the other person who they want to keep away. And so racism and its interplay with economics is absolutely fundamental to understanding how America works from the jump, obviously. And so I think we get caught up in these debates because a lot of people because people are jostling for sort of pride of place within an emerging left coalition. And so when you hear people say, oh, you just care about identity politics, often what's coming out there is a bit of resentment, or however you want to describe it, towards people who used to be very disempowered within a progressive coalition, taking up more space, the space that I would say those issues should take up, and often bringing issues to the fore that have not historically been at the fore, i.e. are not the immediate issues of white men. And so we saw this recently in the controversy over the mayoral candidate, Mello, who Bernie endorsed, who turned out to have a pretty spotty record on choice issues, right, on abortion. It turns out he's come around a little bit, but the fact is that not that this candidate actually turned out to be so bad in the end. It turns out his views on abortion have evolved somewhat, but that Bernie never cared to ask. He didn't check, right? And so what that says to people is that issues that are not of immediate concern to white men might be devalued within this left coalition. And when people pushed back and said, pro-choice absolutely has to be a fundamental tenet of any progressive coalition, other people came back and said, well, people are different, like stop enforcing your identity politics, even though having a progressive coalition that is not necessarily pro-choice means that half of your people are not equal, right? Women are not equal without access to abortion. Anyway, this is a roundabout way of saying that I think when you talk about economic and racial resentment, they go together. They have a complicated, ever-evolving relationship. And that when we think about a progressive coalition, we have to be able to address that complexity in a way that doesn't sort of shove those things off into the identity politics realm, where they're not as important because they're not class. And when it comes to what that coalition might look like, we have a lot of work to do, because I was in dialogue with someone recently and they're like, well, DSA and the platform that was come up with by the Movement for Black Lives have a lot in common. I mean, people basically agree on like 90% of their platforms. But those two organizations are socially not close together. It's not the same people in most cases. The groups haven't always organized together. There are not enough ties yet between those organizations. They're not working on enough campaigns in common. And doing that work together, and for example, DSA getting behind Movement for Black Lives initiatives, as they've now been doing, is what needs to happen in order to actually build multiracial solidarity on the left, which hopefully can then reach out beyond the left and start bringing people into that. I mean, I think just as people's economic interests can produce terrible reactions. They can also produce good reactions. If you get a diverse group of people together in a union all fighting the same boss, those people are more likely to regard each other as allies. Not to be necessarily in perfect harmony, like racism is over, but they're gonna have a very different relationship with each other than when they're set against each other, right? So these sorts of coalitions are potentially fruitful spaces for overcoming the horrible racism and the total lack of solidarity we saw in the last election. Saying that is a lot easier than doing it, because that is more or less how the left has fallen apart in every single generation. I mean, this country's original sin is racism, and the left has not fixed that. And we have a long way to go.
Great. Well, thank you both for this so far, and thank you all for being so attentive. We're going to now go to audience Q&A, and we're going to try and get to as many audience questions as you can. If people want to line up in the aisles, we'll just alternate one side and the other. And please do try and keep your questions somewhat concise and end them with a question mark so that we can get to as many people's questions as we can. Thanks. So let's start with stage left.
Hi, my name's Priya. I'm a fellow PhD member. So my question is about foreign policy. So we talked about how the parties are a lot closer aligned ideologically than most people think. I think one of the clearest ways is foreign policy. You can see that most clearly in the ways liberals cheered on Trump's Syrian strikes. So I'm wondering, like, if the Democratic Party takes like a more economically populist platform, would that necessarily render them like anti-war, or like war is definitely the American way, and like
That's such a good question.
so I'm just wondering what your take on that is.
I'll just say a few words on this, and I don't know, maybe you have thoughts, but I think that's a great question that's not asked enough, and it's not clear what the answer is. I think no, like if Democrats took an economically populist stance, that would not necessarily mean that they would become less hawkish on foreign policy, because obviously, I mean, our greatest jobs program ever was World War II, right? So, no, and I think further, there's a lot of work to be done on this front, and so there's a problem like you have to solve in DSA and with your comrades, but it was like sort of horrifying to watch Bernie on the stump when he was asked about foreign policy, because he literally didn't have one. He would just try to dodge the questions. He did not have super strong positions. He's not hawkish exactly, but he also has no idea of what a foreign policy created by the American government, sort of the seat of empire, how that could be a progressive thing. And maybe it couldn't. Maybe the answer is isolationism. I mean, the left historically, the way that the left operated in terms of foreign policy was to have solidarity with identical lefts in other countries, or lefts that share the same set of values, whether in government or not, and to have a sort of international solidarity. There's no model for how that would work as administered by the American government, right? Leftists can't answer that question. I haven't seen it well answered.
Yeah. I mean, I basically have a version of the same answer, right? That like, so there's this like American elite consensus, and then the broad, I think most ordinary Americans are unhappy with the degree of foreign entanglements. I mean, I think that this is really like, I actually think elite people divide are sometimes overstated, but this is a very real elite people divide, right? That like Democratic and Republican elites, as you mentioned, right, the Syria strikes immediately got praise from all sorts of Democratic elites who are like, yeah, Trump is like a madman, but this was a good idea. And then most people are like, this is a waste. I don't know that the left, and I'm like on the left. I'm not sure that like you would call me a leftist necessarily, but even among like left liberals, I'm not sure there's been much thinking about what it means to be progressive and have progressive values. And also, the United States is an imperial power and has all sorts of obligations that go beyond entanglements that go beyond sort of military conflict to, United States carrier battle groups exist in every major ocean to like make sure that international trade happens smoothly, which itself carries like a lot of ideological content and weight and everything. So I don't know, like, yeah, no one really has an answer, and I'm inclined to say, and this might be a little fatalistic, I'm inclined to say that there's a lot of damage mitigation that can be done, right? That like you can not launch needless wars, you can redivert funds away from Pentagon buildup to, you can do a lot of that, but that as long as the United States occupies the global position that it does, and as long as it sort of sits at the center of kind of the international system as it exists, there are limits to how much you can disentangle, and that the office of the presidency in particular is an office where any occupant is going to end up behaving in ways contrary to progressive values, just inherent in the office, which is like, again, a very fatalistic thing to say, but it seems to fit with our history at the very least.
Yeah, no, I have a colleague who says, like, people ask these questions, he's like, well, you're voting for just like the person to sit in the seat of empire. I mean, like you pick the better one, but that's what it is, like.
Great.
No, what was said about the entanglements of racism and economics, there's so many different like technicals there, and you say, well, yeah, racism was just a deal breaker for me, but that's not why I voted. Like, to me, that's like saying, oh, I've got cancer, but whatever else they would say after that. But my question has to do with like how much seat at the table, like, and I've been doing, because I'm a hardcore leftist, liberal, radical, whatever, I don't even know what I understand. But offering the conservative Republicans a seat at the table, it's like, conservative means to conserve the way it was. Well, let's look back at the way it was. It was crap. There was not everybody was free. So, like, where does conservatism, like, does it even have a place in progressing? Whatever.
I think they're reactionaries who must be defeated.
I think that I don't know if conservatives have a place necessarily. So I have a thought about the Republican Party here, and that is, I think that, and this isn't even about the Republican Party inherent to it, but that if like you were to identify one particular ideological force in American history that is basically the thing that continuously threatens to destroy the entire experiment, it is like white reactionary rage. No, really, I mean, like from
the Civil War, it was real bad. Almost did the whole thing end.
From the nullification crisis to the Civil War to, you can kind of go down the line. It's sort of like an existential threat to the United States. In that at the moment, the Republican Party is the repository for it. And so the Republican Party, and the Republican Party as it exists, which seems to channel and focus that into electoral force, I don't think has a seat on the table. I think there are certainly conservatives who may not share progressive values, but certainly share the kind of like broad pluralistic values of society that if the enemy here is like anti-pluralism, if the enemy here is racial reactionary ideology, then you got to find as many allies as you can, and that doesn't necessarily mean that when those enemies are defeated, you're all like kumbaya, but it does mean that I think there is a place for like a certain kind of, philosophical conservative type.
It's just like those people will always be there, right? It's like they will always be there. We don't set the table.
Right.
Like the table exists as it exists. Our job is to beat them. Like I don't, I think there are different tactics for different
Right.
political opponents. Like extremely, like racist, violent Trump voters are going to be a little hard to have a conversation with. Like David Brooks, I don't know, maybe you can have a conversation with him.
That's
I
like
couldn't.
go on
But-
without me.
Right, but my point is like the idea of having people at the table. I think I totally get that, but I think that's not a choice that's up to us as lefties. We sort of confront what's there and push back on it, and that's how things sort of move
I
forward.
was just trying every angle of, is there literally anything valuable that they have to offer?
Well, if they did, we try to incorporate
Let's say
it.
they weren't infected with racism. Like, is there anything there? Probably not.
Look, like conservatives, there's a complicated conservative history where, you can argue that Republicans today are not conservative in the traditional sense because they're highly capitalistic. So they're all about change and unleashing market forces and so forth. And so the conservation of traditional society, as would be imagined by Burke, is not present in much of what we now call conservatism. And so the history in America of something like paleoconservatism has been both a form of like racial reaction and sort of white supremacy, and it has been anti-capitalist sometimes because capitalism produces change. So you could say that there's some value in that piece of it, but why you would want to take that piece of it from a generally like reactionary platform instead of opposing capitalism from the left, I don't know. So yeah, like interesting ideas come from all different kinds of places, but I would think of conservatives primarily as political opponents. Great.
Hi, my name is Jesse, and I'm a senior here in Florida. I wanted to ask you the question that I asked the sort of polar opposite of this event when I came here a year or two ago about the future of the Republican Party, which is if you is there one particular figure within the Democratic Party or who related to the Democratic Party in some way who best exemplifies your vision for somebody the Democrats should nominate in 2020 and why?
I have no idea if the Democrats should nominate in 2020. I think it's a little too early to be thinking about nomination politics.
How about Chelsea?
So what's funny about that is that like literally no one thinks it's become this weird thing where like no actual human being believes that Chelsea Clinton should be president.
I feel like everyone's a bit anxious. That
Right, it's like this paranoia.
Like another one always comes out.
Yeah, I don't know who the Democrats should nominate. I can certainly talk about who is certainly running. I can tell you who is probably like better positioned than other people, but I don't know who they should nominate. I do have a person in mind though when it comes to not like a politician that should lead the party, but a kind of approach that I think is very helpful and that I think is very fruitful. And that is what you've seen in North Carolina with Reverend William Barber. I think that kind of approach, which is both rooted in it's rooted in the particular disadvantages of many different kinds of communities. It's sort of reaching out. I think Michael Kazin described it as a coalition of the disadvantaged. Not everyone shares the same disadvantage, and there are some overlapping disadvantages. But the key thing is that you're reaching out to other people on the basis of, hey, we both are not getting a fair shake in this society, and if we work together, we have a stronger chance of getting a fair shake. I always encourage people to revisit the 84 and 88 Jesse Jackson campaigns. Jesse Jackson's a very flawed man. A lot of problems with Jesse Jackson, but those campaigns I think are remarkable for the promise they contained. They act as sort of a model, and as just sort of like political trivia, those campaigns basically like seeded the Democratic Party of 20 years later, right? So like you have a lot of Jackson veterans in the Obama 08 effort, and I've argued several times that the significance of the Sanders campaign won't be seen now or 5 years from now, but 20 years from now. Who are the people in Democratic politics who cut their teeth in the Sanders campaign, and what do they do when they're sort of in positions of influence?
Yeah, you should read Jamelle's column on the Jackson campaign, which I read on the plane, which is great. And I think the people I kind of like right now are sort of predictable. I think Ellison is good, also a flawed candidate in lots of ways, but quite good. I think Camilla J. Paul is a good candidate. We'll see how she does. I think there are going to be a sort of new generation of people elected who are sort of in the Sanders mold, and I'm looking forward to seeing those people emerge on the national stage. So hopefully some of them really turn out to be stars.
And Jamelle's column, which is an excellent read, is called Keep Hope Alive, which was also the title of Ellson's convention speech. So for those of you who want to follow up.
I'm Aaron Fagan. I'm not a student here, but I am a member of DSA, starting up a chapter for the Inland Empire based in San Bernardino. Capitalism seems to form an existential threat to humanity, in that it is, the accumulation of wealth by the rich and the decimation of